All for One, the Demon Lord, the master villain of My Hero Academia. This guy sets a lot of this story in motion. He's directly responsible for the creation of One for All. His rivalry with All Might is what forced the latter into retirement. He's the one who created the villain Tomura Shigaraki, and by extension the entire League of Villains. But what's behind that mask? What's his story? What could drive a man to become the world's greatest villain? In this video, we'll be going over All for One's full history and showing you what makes the Master of Evil tick. Let's get to it. A growing darkness. We don't know the circumstances of All for One's birth. His family could be rich or poor, it doesn't really matter. All we can say for sure is that their name was Shigaraki. He and his little brother Yoichi were both big comics fans, avidly enjoying the adventures of one Captain Hero. Interestingly though, All for One eventually stopped reading the comics, despite his brother's insistence that there was more to the story than he realized. He knew how the stereotypical story ended, as much as it annoyed him. As genre-savvy as he was, All for One still saw something to aspire to in the Demon King. That sense of power and control is one that stuck with him all his life. Perhaps the time period they grew up in was what led to that. The two brothers were born in the first era of quirks, just when humanity was first manifesting these strange metahuman powers. The situation was chaotic, with people not knowing how to deal with these insane abilities. There was a lot of violence and danger early on. Some criminals rampaged with their powerful quirks, others set out to protect themselves from their strange neighbors. If the Shigaraki brothers weren't the very first to awaken their abilities, they'd likely have been as scared as everyone else early on. This was the era of the original vigilantes, people rising up to try and force some control upon the world. And as much as he loves to style himself as a master villain, All for One's initial operations fit more closely into the mold of a vigilante. He simply took what he was doing further than most. In a world before the rise of pro-heroes where everything is might makes right and quirks are out of control, ultimate power over these abilities would give anyone a god complex. You have authority over the weapon that's tearing the world apart. You can provide safety and security to the people, offer them a quiet life. He's never identified as such, but there's a firmly Yakuza-esque quality to how All for One tried to operate at first. A sense of respectability to his growing cult. The older Shigaraki actually took a page out of Yoichi's book when it came to building his empire. People serve a Demon King out of fear, but there are more ways to control your followers than that. All for One outlined his philosophy to his brother, showing him a pair of men who were suffering due to their quirks. One man was too weak to defend himself against enhanced criminals. The other had been mutated and was feared by everyone in his life. All for One took the quirk of the mutated man and gave the quirkless one the means to defend himself. At a stroke, both men's lives were changed for the better. Yoichi called All for One out over this, pointing out that he was just accumulating loyal minions, and that's not wrong. This generosity was utterly self-serving, a god bestowing mercy on his subjects. But All for One himself wasn't entirely wrong either. He could help people in ways no one else could. He could shape the world, change people's lives for the better, and do it all with just a wave of his hands. Look at the mutated mob that rallied behind Spinner in the streets. Even with the hero's idealized society, those fears about mutation quirks never left. If All for One had taken their abilities away and made them socially acceptable, would any of those people care about owing him a favor? Don't get this twisted. Shigaraki the Elder is not some misunderstood good guy. He's controlling, arrogant, and utterly self-centered. His one desire was to have power over everything he saw. He's not kidding about the Demon King thing. But he thinks about the people around him more than most of the heroes give him credit for. Just because he dismisses them as tools does not stop him from understanding them. He offered people lost in panic and self-loathing a better world. Despite the name, All for One does not hoard his power. He makes use of it proactively. His quirk is as much about giving other people abilities as it is about taking them. That's the line between being selfish and being self-centered. He's fine with helping other people, but only on his terms and in his way. His control matters more than his personal good. His oh-so-generous offers of mercy were more like a child playing with dolls than a man empathizing with the pain and struggles of others, but it's still something that falls outside that Demon King mindset. That tendency to focus on his pawns is crucial to understanding All for One's approach to rule. And it's what led to the biggest mistake he ever made. But before we get into the rise and fall of history's greatest supervillain, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, hit the notification bell, and hit like for your regular dose of plot armor. Now on with the story. The Hounds. All for One built his little group of devotees well. They were numerous enough to stretch across the country, though this organization was never so blatant that it made it into official history books. His followers were so loyal, they would commit grand terrorist acts in his name, blowing up a skyscraper without so much as an order. You'd think that sort of independent thought would anger the micromanaging narcissist All For One. Most controlling tyrants would be annoyed that his minions would act without orders, risking complicating their plans. On the contrary, however, All For One was excited by their initiative. Rather than a loss of control as far as he was concerned, this took it to the next level. He just had to want something done, and his loyal followers would see to it. This has to have driven his god complex even further. There was only one person who consistently defied the mighty villain. Yoichi Shigaraki never bent the knee to his brother, never accepted his justifications or empire building. He was physically much weaker than the tyrant, but he tried to fight him. When All For One locked him up, Yoichi refused to eat, the one act of defiance left to him. And this struck a curious nerve. As narcissistic as he usually comes off, the elder Shigaraki could not accept this. He couldn't just dismiss his brother as a malfunctioning pawn, something to be cast aside and moved on from. Yoichi was his brother. He mattered to All For One. Even back in his early days, he wanted to convince his little brother that he was right. So the elder Shigaraki tried to control him, the same way he controlled everyone else, by giving him a quirk. This is a mistake powerful, arrogant people like All For One often make. As much as he usually understands people and how they think, his vanity can blind him. He assumed Yoichi would react like all the other supplicants, that his longing for justice was just a weak, quirkless man bitter at the world. Thinking that his brother was no better than him caused Shigaraki the Elder to underestimate him. Surely, once he had a taste of power, Yoichi would understand. He'd cast aside this childish focus on justice and assist in managing his empire. And it's that lack of understanding that led to Shigaraki implanting a power-accumulating quirk within his brother. Unknown to either brother, this act was what created One For All, the multi-generational quirk that would ultimately prove All For One's undoing. The foundation of the heroic quirk is built on resisting the tyrannical Shigaraki, and over 9 generations that fire has never wavered. At the start though, it just seemed like another failure. All For One left his brother in that cell, a failure he'd rather forget about. In time, Yoichi would be rescued by those already trying to fight against All For One. After all, no villainous tyranny can exist without someone trying to fight back. These vigilantes took him with them, and in time they would become the second and third inheritors of the quirk. Unfortunately, these early heroes weren't able to accomplish much, no matter how hard they struggled. This era saw All For One's group become a true empire, a shadowy cartel of crime that spread its fingers of influence across the nation. One For All was not really a factor in these early days. Without multiple generations to build up its strength, it was far less impressive than the version wielded by All Might and Deku. All For One fought many bearers of the quirk, but they were powerless against his might. His control was effectively unopposed. We don't have exact numbers for how long this criminal empire lasted, but it endured for a long time. Toshinori Yagi bore One For All for 40 years. The fourth wielder, Higaki Shinomori, held it for 18. Some wielders may have died comparatively quickly, but we don't know how much time passed between All For One's rise and the creation of One For All. In total, All For One's reign has to have endured for over 50 years, possibly as many as 75 to 100. And all that time, heroes were trying to stop him. All For One got through 6 more generations of inheritors without breaking a sweat. Their efforts to challenge his rule never amounted to much. The fourth never even made the attempt, spending his time in isolation. It's at some point during this time that All For One realized what his brother had created. This rival quirk intrigued him. He tried to steal it more than once, but he never succeeded. By the time of the 7th inheritor, Nana Shimuda, All For One wasn't even bothering to hunt the One For All wielders anymore. They were just a distraction, a simple comedy to take his mind off the drudgery of running his empire. But in the end, this complacency doomed him. Toshinori Yagi, the 8th bearer of One For All, rose up to become the great hero All Might. He finally struck down the tyrant, destroyed his empire, and ushered in a golden era of heroism. Eventually. In the meantime, All For One met a certain boy beneath an overpass, an act that would have profound ramifications for them both. A shift in the times. People have a misconception about the confrontation between All Might and All For One. This epic clash between the two was not one brief fistfight, the foreign hero zooming back from America to finally gain revenge for his sister. There were years between All Might's return and All For One's fall. That battle was the climax of another story, the world's #1 hero launching a dedicated hunt for the villain who ruled from the shadows. Both of them must have seen that final confrontation coming. All Might spent years taking apart All For One's shadowy operations, trying to find some sign of the master criminal. It was deeply annoying. Finally, a hero was actually able to get under his skin. And knowing that, All For One's actions take on a new meaning. He was entirely aware of All Might's power and that he was seeking him out personally. How could he not be? But he never tried to flee the country, never took measures to try and tip the balance of power in his favor. You might think this was simple arrogance on his part, but no. The older Shigaraki was far from idle in the days leading up to that climactic fight. He took several precautions in advance of that fateful meeting with All Might, setting into effect multiple contingency plans. They just weren't meant to help him win. Indeed, All For One didn't seem to be thinking about himself at all with any of the preparations we saw him make during this time. He sent away Gigantomachia, his greatest bodyguard. He duplicated his quirk, wielding the copy but leaving the original in storage with Garaki. The two of them together created the being known as Kurogiri, a loyal assistant who wouldn't break under any amount of pressure. All of these measures seem to be designed to endure without All For One. As far as we can tell, even at this early stage, the shadowy crime lord was planning for what came after him. But what was all this for? What was he intending to set in motion? Well, All For One talked briefly with his new aide Kurogiri about villainy, pondering what the word should mean. And it's in his definition of the divide between hero and villain that we get a real hint of his long-term thinking. I believe that the concept should be defined by a particular relationship between a person's will and their quirk. When that will and that quirk support each other to create a firm bedrock of resolve, well, those people are called heroes. But when an extreme and violent will stimulates a quirk into running amok, or on the flip side, when an unruly quirk twists a person's will to its own ends, that disparity creates a dangerous imbalance. Unstable characters like that deviate from their pigeonholes in society and threaten to destroy the entire framework. As such, that sort of logical evil or enemy of society is shunned and scorned as a villain. Under this definition, would All For One consider himself a villain? His will is strong and we've not seen him make impulsive choices in the past. When he ruled Japan from the shadows, he was the establishment. He brought peace. He was a hero, to his followers at least. But now All Might was here. Toshinori had become a legendary hero, one the public would accept as such, and other pro-heroes were rising in his wake. This was no longer an era where villainy and crime could prosper. Yoichi's legacy had eclipsed everything All For One tried to build. That miserable, cliched happy ending was looming over his head like the sword of Damocles. He could fight against the rising tide, or he could accept it and plan around it. And ever the pragmatist, All For One chose the second option. There is an infamous Mario fan game called Super Kaizo World. It was designed to be torturously hard, and its most legendary feature is a trap that kills you after you have seemingly beaten a stage. When the heroes feel content, assured of their victory, that's when they're at their weakest. The genre-savvy All For One devised a Kaizo trap of his own. He'd cultivate a new symbol of fear to grow, and one day unseat the symbol of peace. He'll leave a generation of villains to pick at the cracks of All Might's world, bring down this second-rate feel-good ending, and bring the nation back to the chaos of his youth. Remember what we said before about the difference between selfishness and self-centeredness? It can come across like a self-centered attitude is better in that it allows some degree of compassion and thought for others. But in reality, it can be so much worse. A selfish man would cling to life, his little luxuries, and what power he still had. All For One doesn't care about such trivialities. He will gladly give of himself. He'll take the loss, get thrown into Tartarus, even die. It doesn't matter if he lives as much as it matters he was right. He wants to prove that the world works as he thinks it does. He'll create a symbol of fear that will outlive him and the society his brother dreamed of. It's either his way or nothing. The prime candidate for this world-ending symbol of fear would be the young Tenko Shimura. Even early on, All For One knew that he held immense potential, personally overseeing his education. He worked hard to encourage the young boy to indulge in his worst, most destructive instincts. And he seems to have been proud of the result. For a man with the arrogance of All For One, letting this kid take his name could not have been a light decision. Just as with his brother, the villain values Tomura. That shouldn't be mistaken for care, but more as appreciation for the craft he put into making Tomura a symbol of fear. And of course, using him in this manner was the ultimate dig at Toshinori. Much later, All For One would use Shigaraki's connection to Nana Shimura to openly torment All Might. He held on to that secret for over a decade, but it was the perfect weapon against the dutiful hero. The abandoned grandchild of his beloved mentor turned against the symbol of peace. Truly, the master of villains couldn't have asked for a better hand. Interestingly though, Tomura was never All For One's only candidate for a successor. He had a whole creche of young kids he was investing in training, thanks to Garaki's network of orphanages. He saved Toya Todoroki from his flames with the intent of cultivating him as a villain. He personally tutored Number 6 into taking the form of Overclock. It raises some questions about exactly how far All For One's influence extended. Did he try to exacerbate social tensions around quirks in Japan? He may not have had a direct hand in the origins of characters like Toga and Spinner, but they fit perfectly into his long-term plans. By this point, the older Shigaraki has adopted a different attitude from his original empire building plans. Even though on paper he still has his shadowy organization to control. None of these individuals are helpful for maintaining his position. They aren't even necessarily all that loyal to him. They're all people who fit the vision he outlined to Kurogiri, those with quirks that drive them out of control or with a will that puts them outside of societal norms. They're outcasts, the trampled on, those with no place in the world maintained by the symbol of peace. By the end of his era of control, All For One was no longer making pawns, he's making villains. Even as All Might was closing in on him, All For One was stacking the board for round 2, even if he wasn't sure he'd live to see it. The rise of the League. His fight with All Might cost All For One dearly. He lost his control over Japan, his criminal empire, and a lot of his resources. He was badly wounded, scarred almost beyond recognition, but he wasn't dead and refused to truly become inactive. He'd already been laying the groundwork for a successor. In the 5 years between his death and the start of My Hero's story, this process only intensified. This is what leads to the plot of My Hero Academia Vigilantes. All For One isn't directly involved in that story, but behind the scenes he instigates a large portion of its plot. His experiments with the quirk-boosting drug Trigger and patronage of the man known as Number 6 directly set in motion everything that happened. Come the nightmare night of the finale, All For One was able to sit back and observe his handiwork. That's a constant thing for the master villain. He loves to watch a good fight. Even with a lucrative criminal venture coming down around him, his main source of irritation was not having a view of the action. For all his urbane sophistication, All For One is as much of a fanboy as Deku. He loves to watch heroes and villains in action. A lot of All For One's actions in these 5 years were very low-key. He took the time to cultivate new resources and set up the League of Villains for Tomura. Of particular note, however, is that it was at this time that he found what would become one of his most valuable tools, Yuga Aoyama. All For One had given the young boy his new quirk during his reign, but the family hadn't forgotten what the villain did. Once All For One heard his rival would become a teacher at UA, he insisted Yuga join the school and report on openings that the League could later exploit. Still, this was supposed to be Tomura's era. Even if his master still endured, he had no reason to claim the spotlight. Thus, while All For One continued to act as a mentor to the younger Shigaraki, he remained in the shadows, letting his successor lead his own campaign against All Might. But that only worked for so long. Tomura was young and inexperienced. Eventually, All For One had to take the field once again, all for the sake of his heir. The final stage. It's worth noting how much All For One has invested in the League. While any of his pawns are ultimately expendable, Tomura and his friends matter a great deal to him. He steps into the fray during the Kamino Ward raid purely to save Shigaraki and the League. None of the heroes were even aware of his direct involvement with the group. He could have discarded the young villains easily and withdrawn back into the shadows. He knows the need to set aside pawns when he has to. But as he tells Tomura, his personal losses are inconsequential to him now. All of this effort and work is for the sake of his successor. And so, he went for round 2 with Toshinori Yagi. Just like their last brawl all those years ago, there was no real chance of All For One leaving Kamino free. Even if he managed to kill All Might, the other pro-heroes would have taken him down. By electing to stay, All For One ensured he'd be locked up in Tartarus. The only victory in the cards for him would have been entirely Pyrrhic, a little taste of vengeance for his losses years ago, getting to show the world their symbol of peace bloody and broken. But even with his defeat, All For One was satisfied. With the master villain in custody, police pressure on the League of Villains seriously de-escalated. With All For One safely locked away, Tomura and his friends became a far lower priority for the authorities, free to lurk in some no-name warehouse and deal with a Shi-Hakaisai. Just as the elder Shigaraki intended, he'd already won simply by covering for the other villains. His later breaking out of Tartarus was simply a final step to further assist the League and Tomura in their cause. This is no longer his era, just as it's no longer All Might's. He's just holding out to tip the scales of the new era towards something he finds more pleasing. But this leads us to one final question, one that's become increasingly important following All For One's escape from Tartarus. Is he loyal to Tomura? He's given up a lot for the sake of his disciple, sacrificing his own liberty and resources. He claims that he holds deep respect for Tomura's will, even being willing to die to help his team win the fight. But it's hard to think of All For One being committed to anyone except himself, given how much his own personality seems to reside within One For All and the comment he made about becoming a great demon lord. It's easy to view Tomura as nothing more than a pawn for the old villain. A new vessel to inhabit via his quirk rather than an heir he wants to see outlive him. The One For All inheritors speculate that all this is one big scheme to steal their power, and that's certainly plausible. So where does that leave us? Is Tomura a pawn or a true heir? It's a frustratingly ambiguous point. But remember how All For One sees the world around him. To him, both can be true. Tomuda is his masterwork, a successor he's proud of and put a lot of effort into creating. But he's ultimately just a means to an end, a child who will follow in his footsteps, like it or not. As the elder Shigaraki tells Dabi, he has many paths leading to the same end goal. Were Tomuda to fail him, it would be annoying, but far from fatal. Even now, he may have more cards yet to play. Just how many young villains did he cultivate in the years since he fell to All Might? And with that, we have the complete history of All for One. How do you think this story will end? Will the villains remain loyal to his vision, or will they finally break away from him? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. I've been Jack Stansbury, and have an awesome day.